And also, a couple years ago, I was in rehab, and I went to a rehab that was like a small group, so it was only 12 people. And there was a guy in the group, was wearing a MAGA hat. And at the time, I was gung-ho, like anti, you know what I mean? I was just like a bleeding heart liberal. And I was like, in my head, I was like, I'm not going to talk to that guy. By the end of the thing, him and I were very close. And I remember when we hugged each other, goodbye, I kind of got teary-eyed. I was like, dude, I'll see you, call me, this and that, right? And I realized we have way more in common than not.
That's right.
You know what I mean? And it was like the media, and it was like social media and all that stuff pitting us against each other.
know.
And it's not even real.
I know.
We were so similar in every way.
Right.
possible.
It's like the jangling keys. There's people who want to keep Americans apart.
Yeah.
And it's like, watch this.
Look over here.
While I'm robbing the bank and stealing you all blind.
Yeah.
And we're all looking at the keys and, not seeing that he just stole the Tesla or whatever.
Yeah.
And we're all distracted by hating each other. And then, the kind of the central organizing theme of my campaign is finding values that we have in common rather than these little issues that keep us apart.
But how do you change that? How do you change, false information online? How do you change all these?
Or even how do we change ourselves from being so easily attracted by the dangling keys? Like, is there something like inherent about why it's so easy to kind of be distracted?
Well, my dad was campaigning. My dad was in really the same position I am in many ways. Because he was running against a war. He was running against a president of his own party. He was running against an entire infrastructure that was a power that was aligned against him. The unions were against him. The big city mayors were against him. The liberal press was against him. Even the university students at that time were against him because he was ending draft deferments. And the people who he had brought into power in 1960, 8 years earlier, were all working for Johnson. So they were against him. But he was able to put together this coalition by just telling the truth to people and telling them truths that they didn't want to hear. And he went against all the kind of political wisdom of, you have to tell people what they want to hear. And he would go to colleges like Creighton University in Nebraska and the students asked him, are you going to keep our draft deferments? That was the reason most kids were in college, because they didn't want to go to Vietnam. And he said, no, I'm not going to, because it's unfair that 50% of every paratrooper unit in Vietnam is black, because they don't have access to the college. He said, I can get my 11 kids into college and get them out of the draft. That means that the wars can be fought by black people alone, and that's not, a good result. And so he got booed at first, but then at the end he'd get a standing ovation. And he did that all over the country, telling people news that they didn't want to hear. And as it turns out, it worked. The last day of his life, he won the most rural state in the country, South Dakota, and the most urban state. And when I was, when we rode on that train and brought his body from, I was with him when he died, and then we brought his body from Penn Central in New York to Union Station in Washington. It was it should have been a 2.5-hour train ride. It was a 7-hour train ride because the tracks were lined with people, and the people with a whole cross-section of Americans. They were whites and blacks and people in military uniforms, hippies. And he had, and rabbis and priests and nuns. I remember going through Delaware and seeing 7 nuns standing in the back of a pickup truck outside of Wilmington, waving their rosary beads at us. And it was this entire cross-section of the American experience that he had been able to unite, really by telling people the truth, and instead of appealing to their anger and their greed and their xenophobia and bigotry, he had tried to remind them of the hero that's inside of all of us, and that we're part of a community, and that we've got to resist the seduction of the notion that the only way to advance ourselves as a people is by leaving our poor brothers and sisters behind, that we have to go together. And people, people were willing to put aside, to transcend their narrow self-interest and see themselves as part of a larger community and a noble adventure. And I think we have to get back to that vision, of bringing Americans together, the Trump people, and as you said, when you start talking to people, you find all these things we have in common. And part of the censorship regime is to keep us from talking to each other.
Yeah. That was the first time where I was like, what's the matter?
No, I just want him to stay close to the mic. I am trying to.
I thought you were doing the emo thing
signal.
again. I was like,
I can't get
I thought you were doing the Toby thing. And I was like, that's over, Cheryl. We're not doing that right
I'm still
now.
terrified.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And ever since I met that dude, right? I want to say his name, but the MAGA guy that was in my rehab, it's opened my eyes because then I went to Dollywood. Remember I went to Dollywood, and in my mind it was like, I'm just an amusement park. Where is it in
Tennessee.
Tennessee, right?
Right, Tennessee.
And I'm like a Korean loudmouth, kind of a crazy comedian, and I went in there and. There was just love there,
Yeah.
even for me. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah.
And these are people that probably generally vote right or
Right.
whatever, but I felt like this kinship with people, and I just kind of went, you know what, dude? I'm not. I think I'm gonna change my whole worldview on this thing.
Yeah.
Well, there's the internet and there's just real life.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
there's
yeah.
internet vitriol. Even us podcasting for as long as we have, it's like there's that, and you go out into the world and you're like, I'm not hearing, like insults thrown at me all
Right.
day.
Yeah,
the
yeah,
people
yeah.
are generally decent.
That's true.
Kind,
hardworking
yeah.
and
Yeah.
kind.
Yeah. Yeah.
And inherently good, I think.
Yes.
So
I agree.
how do we get? So what happens now? I mean, because I don't know much about politics. Here I'm going to ask a dumb question.
No,
Okay.
no dumb question.
So you're running in the Democratic primary. What happens? How do we do this? How does Biden step aside? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
how
And
does-
then is there a debate?
is there a debate? How does
Well,
this